Hey Worldlet class. Last week we talked about the medieval romance as an important genre in medieval European literature, and we also talked about author Chretien de Troyes, who kind of pioneered the medieval romance. And so you guys began reading, and by now have hopefully finished reading Lancelot the Knight of the Cart, one of Chretien de Troyes' really famous works. And in it he introduces the character of Lancelot, who's become a really important character in Arthurian legend. Now, obviously, uh, the entire story of Lancelot and of Lancelot and Guinevere is not told in Lancelot the Knight of the Cart, because that wasn't the style of the medieval romance at the time. The medieval romance was a story of a quest, one particular quest that was one particular part of one particular knight's life. And it was only a kind of a small window into a much larger story. Eventually, the story of Lancelot and Guinevere is fleshed out, and the story of all Arthurian legend is fleshed out. And there's kind of a comprehensive book that's written later that covers all the parts of Arthurian legend. But early on in the history of the medieval romance, when Chretien de Troyes was writing, it was a very limited thing, and it was just one particular quest. And so that is the story of Lancelot the Knight of the Cart. It's the story of one of Lancelot's quests and one of his escapades with Guinevere. But it doesn't tell the entire story. We get the entire story later. So before we move on to talking about quest, because that's part of the medieval romance, early on it's a story of one particular quest, one particular knight. Before we move into that, I do want to kind of wrap up a little bit of discussion on the medieval romance. So I'm going to want you guys to respond to medieval romance in Lancelot. So last week we were talking about some key characteristics of the medieval romance. Now, normally at this point, if we were in the classroom and not doing distance learning, this would be the time where I ask you guys to call out answers and I would write them on the board and we would discuss them. Obviously, that's not going to work in this format. So what we're going to do instead is, after you've watched this lecture, I will have some questions at the bottom that I will ask you to respond to, and post your thoughts on where you see medieval romance in Lancelot. I'll also be posting the characteristics of medieval romance that we talked about last week. I'll post them under the video so that you can use them when you're answering your questions. So think about that, perhaps as you're listening to the rest of the lecture. How did you see some of the characteristics of the traditional medieval romance in Lancelot? It is a very classic example of medieval romance, very, very much so. Many of the characteristics that we see in other medieval romances are very, very present in Lancelot. So I think you should have a pretty easy time finding some of those characteristics and explaining them. What I really want to spend most of our time talking about today is the medieval quest. The quest is a really, really important theme and motif and structure in medieval literature. And it's there not just for knights, it's there in other ways as well. The hunt for the unicorn is a kind of quest that I've mentioned before. Later on, we're also going to be looking at Dante's Divine Comedy, which is another type of quest. It's another way that the quest is kind of experienced. It's a very spiritual quest, whereas some of the knights' quests are much more in the realm of the physical world. But it is a quest nonetheless, and the quest is a very, very important feature in medieval literature. And so I'm going to want you guys to think about how you saw the quest play out in Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, and then I'm going to want you to be thinking about how you see quest play out in some of the other works that we read moving forward. So, a brief definition of the quest. The medieval quest was the pursuit of something or someone of special importance. All right, I want to break that definition down just a little bit so that we can really see some of the characteristics of the quest. So, one of the first things that I want us to pay attention to is the fact that the medieval quest was the pursuit of something or someone of special importance. So, a quest is really characterized by going out after something. Right? You have to leave where you're at, kind of your home base, and you have to go and pursue something that you're questing after. We would call that the quest object, right? Whatever you're trying to achieve through your quest is the quest object. And so in order to do that, it requires an actual sort of physical movement and pursuit. The quest object is elsewhere, and you must leave your home to go find it. Part of that pursuit is experiencing a series of adventures. So when you're on the quest, when you've left and you're on the journey, you're going to experience a series of adventures along the way. This is one of the very typical elements of the medieval romance from a literary standpoint, because it's not just one event that happens, right? They don't travel and they arrive and take care of everything. While they are traveling, they undergo a series of adventures. And so there is kind of stages in the process, different meetings with different people, different obstacles that have to be overcome. So the adventures usually take the form of the knight undergoing a number of trials, right? There are various obstacles that they have to overcome, surmount in order to achieve their quest object. It may simply be the difficulties of travel, of voyaging far, right? And that's no easy feat in and of itself in the medieval era. Traveling was seen as fraught with danger. Most people didn't travel, right? Most people stayed at home because traveling involved bandits and thieves and harsh weather and wild animals. And so most people didn't travel, they stayed at home. So in the medieval mindset, even traveling was seen as fraught with danger and was an adventure in and of itself. Encountering difficulties, right? There might be a wide variety of difficulties that the knight encounters. Maybe it's that they can't find a certain place that they're looking for. Maybe it is that they literally come up against some sort of mystical supernatural being, like a wizard or a witch or something, who kind of stands in their path. Maybe they meet a maiden who's in distress and she gives them a particular task to complete. But there are a variety of difficulties that they have to endure. They sometimes have to face monsters, right? There may be mythological beings or wild beasts that they have to overcome that threaten their safety, that they've got to take care of. Maybe the beast or monster is threatening the safety of someone else, and that someone else has a key that they need, not a literal key, but they have something that they need in order to continue on their quest. Challenging evil men. That's another common thing. Sometimes the knight just comes up against bad guys, right? People who are evil and are only looking out for themselves and don't really care about others. And the knight has to stand up to them and challenge them and defeat them in order to progress on their quest. Hopefully, and this is generally the case in the medieval quest, the knight vanquishes all challenges, right? Whatever comes his way, he vanquishes, he overcomes, and he emerges victorious and achieves the quest object. So the quest object comes in this other part of the definition. The medieval quest was the pursuit of something or someone of special importance. So that's getting at the idea of the quest object, right? It is a pursuit, but it's a pursuit after something specific and something significant, right? Something that is significant to the knight. So this may be a person or it might be an object, but it is something that is very significant to them. And that significance could be a personal significance, right? Something that the knight himself feels a very personal connection to, is very important to him, but it may not be important to other people, right? It's important to the knight, but it might not be important to others. Or it could be a spiritual significance, in which case it would be important to all people in the medieval era, right? We've talked before about how medieval Europe is almost entirely Christian. And so if the quest object is of spiritual significance, it would be significant to all, but the knight would be on the quest to kind of prove his worth in a spiritual sense, right? To prove that he is pure and good by attaining this spiritual quest object. And whatever that might be. It might be an actual object, or maybe it's a sort of event, a landmark event that is of spiritual significance. So, in the world of medieval romance, the effect of the quest is kind of, it gives a driving narrative to the story of the knight, right? The knight is only worthy once he has undertaken and completed and accomplished a difficult quest. So there's this idea in the literary world. Now, this probably wasn't true in the real historical world, but in the literary world, every knight we see has to go on a quest to prove that he's worthy. Many times in Arthurian legend, the knight has to prove that he's worthy to be one of the Knights of the Round Table by going on a quest. And this is partly because throughout the process of the quest, the knight matures. He becomes more worthy in the eyes of the court because he's no longer a naive, innocent young lad, right? A boy in a sense. He becomes a man. So in many ways, the quest is kind of a coming of age rite in medieval literature, right? And it's this idea that there is this progress from boy to man that the knight undergoes when he goes on the quest. So that is all kind of accomplished through this idea of growth, right? And the hero grows through the quest narrative. The quest narrative is really a narrative of growth. As I was saying, kind of a coming of age story, but it is a narrative of personal growth, even for the knights who have come of age and they're not doing their initial proving of their worth, but they continue to prove their worth and they continue to grow in their character through continued quests throughout their lives. Knights didn't just go on one quest and then they were done, they continued to go on quests. And there's this pattern of growth. Now this is important because this is a very different idea from the ancient Greek and ancient Roman ideas of what a hero was like prior to the medieval era. The heroes of ancient Greece and Rome were in many ways seen as godlike and perfect, right? They almost could do no wrong. The Aeneid, Aeneas in Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid, is very much kind of a perfect ideal Roman. He's not entirely flawless, but that's mostly according to our modern definition. I'm not sure that Virgil would have seen any flaws in him, the author. I'm not sure the ancient Romans would have seen any flaws in the character of Aeneas. He's kind of the model Roman citizen. He doesn't have any problems, so he doesn't really need to grow and become any better at something. This is kind of true for a lot of the ancient Greek heroes as well. Odysseus in the Odyssey. He's not really growing as a person. He's kind of already all the greatness he needs to be, right? His problem is with other people. There's a sense of that in the Iliad as well, right? Hector and Achilles don't really see that they have any problems. They are justified in what they do, right? They're making the right decisions according to them. So the ancient Greek and Roman idea is this idea of the perfection of the hero. The hero is already perfect because they're godlike. Many of them are demigods, right? Whereas the heroes of the medieval era, the knights, are very, very human, and the medieval authors go to extra lengths to paint how human they are, that they are fallible, that they make mistakes, that they do the wrong thing, that they have problems. And so the idea that the hero needs to grow is kind of a radical new idea in medieval literature. And so the growth of the knight is incredibly important in the medieval literary theme realm, right? The growth of the knight shows that the medieval society is aware of the limitations of humanity and that they're not perfect. They struggle with sin and with making mistakes and making the wrong decision. And so this whole process of the growth of the knight really highlights how different the perspective of the medieval world was from the perspective of Greece and Rome. So the kind of pattern of growth that we see in the quest narrative is that we begin with a young and immature and overconfident knight, right? The knight is confident in his abilities. They are sure that they are prepared for the challenges. But this only highlights that they're kind of immature, right? Because to be mature is to recognize our own limitations, to recognize that we can't do it all on our own. To think that we can do it all on our own is a sign that we are overconfident, right? We may feel just like we're confident, but in fact we're overconfident, and that shows our immaturity. Usually then the knight faces some sort of insurmountable problem, some problem that they're not going to be able to handle on their own, right? That they're going to need to ask for assistance for. And so the knight has to admit defeat, and by admitting defeat has to recognize his weakness and has to thereby say, I was overconfident before, right? I was immature, I was overconfident, I thought I was all that, and I wasn't. And this is very, very different from the ancient Greek and Roman heroes. The ancient Greek and Roman heroes wouldn't admit that they were overconfident. They wouldn't admit that they had any weaknesses. They would just kind of plow on through. But the knight recognizes his own weaknesses and calls for the help of others. As a result of that, the knight receives enlightenment, right? The knight receives help, assistance, and a new sense of self, a new sense of who they are, and a recognition of their place in society, that they're not the most important, that they're not the most powerful, that they're not the most amazing knight in the world, but they become okay with that, and through that process they achieve maturity. So the idea of the quest isn't originally a medieval Christian thing. It's originally a Celtic thing. And the Celts were a group of people who lived in England prior to the arrival of the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. And so this idea of the quest has been around for a very, very long time. And it primarily came from the fact that when Celts had a problem that made continuing to live where they were currently living no longer possible, they would have to send out one of their bravest warriors to scout and try to find a new home. And so the bravest Celtic leaders would often be asked to leave their tribes and find a new home for their tribe, and then the tribe would migrate. The Celts migrated a great deal, and sometimes this was because of famine or flood or some sort of natural disaster. Sometimes it was because of overpopulation, and the tribe needed to split, and part of the tribe needed to find a new home. Sometimes this came from warfare. They were threatened by a neighboring tribe. And so there were often situations where the Celtic tribes, they had been settled in one location, and they felt the need to move. But they would first send out one of their brave warriors, one of their leaders, to go find a new place. And the quest object was a new home, right? And so that's where the idea of the quest really comes from, is from this idea of the Celtic quest of searching for a new home. Of course, over time, as medieval Europe rises and the rise of feudalism, the feudal system, and the rise of Christianity in Europe, the quest changes, right? The narrative changes a little bit, and it takes on a much more spiritual significance with the Christian church, but also a more medieval significance. The medieval people didn't migrate as much, right? And so the quest object oftentimes becomes a literal object or a person rather than a new place to live. So it shifts as things shift in Europe, but the idea is a very, very old one. All right. So this would also be another point where I would ask you guys to call out ideas and I would write them down about how you saw the quest appear in Lancelot. Again, I think Lancelot is kind of a prime example of the quest, and you can really see that in a lot of ways in Lancelot, especially since we read the whole thing. You can see Lancelot's quest kind of from beginning to end. And so when you're answering some questions on this lecture, I am going to ask you to identify some elements of the quest that you saw in the story of Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. So that wraps up our discussion on Lancelot and the quest and the medieval romance. Those are things you're going to need to keep in mind as we read some more Arthurian legend. We're not done with Arthurian legend yet, even though we're done with Lancelot, because Arthurian legend is so important, right? It's so important to medieval literature and one of the most significant stories that comes out of medieval literature. So we are done with Lancelot when you finish this assignment, and we will be moving on to Percival, the story of the Holy Grail. This is a very, very important quest in the medieval world, and there are many, many versions of the Grail story. And they have different knights going on the quest. In fact, in Arthurian legend, almost every knight is said to have been on the quest for the Holy Grail at some point. So we're going to dive into that. So it'll be important to remember the quest and the medieval romance as we move on to Percival and then on to other works. So tomorrow I will be posting some more information about Percival and the reading you can do on Percival. and then some discussions and some various assignments. I'm going to give you a couple days. We're not going to read the entirety of Percival. We're going to read a shorter section of it. So I'm not going to give you quite as long, but I am going to give you a few days to work on Percival. So for today, make sure to answer the questions on this video about Lancelot and wrap up our discussion of Lancelot. And then tomorrow you will see some things from me that are posted that will give you some more instructions on what to do and what to read from Percival. All right, guys, I hope you guys have a great day. As always, call me, email me, or send me a message in Canvas if you guys have any questions. All right, guys, see you later.